So how about the expectation game? Can this new round of negotiations succeed when all others have failed? Joining me now to offer their take, Nathan Miller, former director of speechwriting for Israel's permanent mission to the United Nations. He's currently the principal of Miller Inc., a strategic communication firm. It's based in Los Angeles. And Dr. Ziad Asali. He's the president and founder of the American Task Force on Palestine and a longtime activist on Middle East issues. So, gentlemen, welcome to The Heat. Let's start there. Former Secretary of State Jim Baker once said, "We can't want it more than they do." Do both sides want it? And I'll start with you, Doctor.
Well, I always found that strange. If we can't want it more than they can, then it is not our strategic interest. You cannot say that statement, and the very next statement would be, it is in our strategic interest. If it is in our strategic interest, it really doesn't matter whether they want it or don't want it, and we pursue our own interest.
Nathan, let me get your take on that. What do you think of Jim Baker's comment?
I think both sides want peace, but he's absolutely right. They can't want it. The American government can't want it more than the parties, and at the end of the day, it's going to take both sides sitting down and making the tough compromises that they're going to have to make this peace process move forward. And I think we saw this week with Prime Minister Netanyahu, or this month rather, releasing 104 prisoners, men with blood, the blood of innocent Israelis on their hand, and he did it at great cost to try to get these talks moving. So I think the question is, does President Abbas have the ability and the desire to make those same kind of painful sacrifices to get peace talks moving? And this, you've got to remember, this is the same Mahmoud Abbas who walked away from a very generous peace offer in 2008, who's continued to fan the flames of incitement against Israel and promote and glorify terrorists, and who frankly has absolutely no control today in the Gaza Strip. That area is controlled by Hamas, a terrorist organization, and Gaza will eventually be where 40% of the population of a future Palestinian state would live. So these are big challenges and big questions that have to be dealt with in order for the peace to move forward.
Dr. Asali, I want to give you a chance to respond before we move on to the next question.
Yeah, well, it's everything that was mentioned has been said by the Israelis before we started this process of negotiating. And nevertheless, they entered into these negotiations with this same President Abbas, who's done all these terrible things in the past, supposedly. This is what you have. The Israelis do not have a choice with who will represent the Palestinians, and you can safely say that the Palestinians would not have had Mr. Netanyahu on the top of the list to be leading the other negotiations. This is what it is, and I think it is very important to bring an attitude that is less polarizing to this particular conversation than the previous negotiations, precisely because there is a commitment from the United States at this high personal level that Mr. Secretary Kerry is displaying personal commitment with courage, an ingredient that's indispensable for the success of the negotiations. So it would be a good time to give this man a chance, to give the negotiations a chance, and be less polarizing as we approach this.
Who has more to lose if the talks fail yet again? Nathan, why don't I start with you?
Listen, both sides have a lot to lose. I think that at the end of the day, Israelis desperately want peace. I think the poll you cited, shows that clearly. And I think Israelis are looking to Mr. Abbas and to the other Palestinian leadership to demonstrate on the other side that they're ready to talk to their own people about the difficult sacrifices that both sides are going to have to make. This is not going to be easy. It's going to be challenging on both sides, and I agree. We need to start seeing the Palestinian leadership take the same kind of steps that Prime Minister Netanyahu did to get these talks started in order to really move this forward.
Doctor, I saw you nod your head.
Yeah, I think it would be good, and also it would be good for sitting cabinet members in the Israeli government to agree with their prime minister as he approaches this, while they say there'll never be a two-state solution. So we need to face the obvious. The Palestinians and the Israelis are divided in their perception of this conflict and the way to solve it. It is high time to bring an attitude of trying to interlink between people who are serious about solving this issue and not making generalizations about the whole other tribe. That applies both ways.
Is a two-state solution the only acceptable outcome, would you say? I see you nodding your head, Doctor.
It's not the only acceptable solution. It's the only solution. There are other options, many other options, none of which is a conflict-ending solution. The two-state solution is the only one that could potentially end the conflict, where you get part of the pie, the other guy gets another part of the pie, and we can, you don't end up with nothing. Nothing is an unstable situation. The status quo, in referring to your previous question, linking it with this, the status quo, who has more to lose, is the occupation. The Palestinians are occupied people. So if they lose, they continue being occupied. And the solution to that is to end the occupation, give Israel a country, safe, secure, accepted in the neighborhood, and give the Palestinians something where they can be first-class citizens. That is why it's a meaningful solution.
Nathan, do you agree? Two-state solution, the only acceptable outcome?
Absolutely. Two-state solution is the only solution. But I just want to respond to the previous comment, which was, that we can't speak in generalities. And I absolutely agree. And I think we have to deal with the specifics on the ground. And I think any discussion of peace has to begin with, how do we defeat Hamas? Hamas is a terrorist, internationally recognized terrorist organization explicitly opposed to peace, an organization whose charter calls for the destruction of Israel and the genocide of Jews, who continues to pursue violence against Israelis. And I think what we're looking for, not just from President Abbas, but for the international community, is to think about these major obstacles, which at the end of the day, if we want peace to last, we're going to have to deal with things like Hamas in Gaza, which controls, like I said, the area where 40% of the future Palestinian state will, or the population rather, will be.
Well, let me throw that question in your direction. Can there be an agreement that's sustainable without Hamas? And Hamas has been in opposition to these talks.
Yes. First off, let me state our position regarding Hamas. Hamas is declared a terrorist organization by the government of the United States. This is good enough for me. Hamas has not been helpful in trying to arrive at any conclusions to this issue. Now, the more relevant fact now is that Hamas is not even at the table of the negotiations. So the Palestinians feel sufficiently empowered to negotiate without Hamas. The United States and Israel both accepted to negotiate with Abu Mazen, who does not represent Hamas, does not claim he represents Hamas, and still is viable enough to be a partner. So part of the negotiations, I would hope, would have to be, what kind of an environment are we going to have after we reach a deal? Discussing the Hamas and the whole issues that are related to how we sustain the peace is part of the process. But to say Hamas is an obstacle to peace, then we don't get to peace, is a concession.
Nathan, let me ask you this question. Many analysts say if these peace talks fail, the next step for the Palestinians is press their claim against Israel in the International Court of Justice. Could that provide a permanent solution?
At the end of the day, this is only going to be worked out on a bilateral basis. Unilateral steps like President Abbas took at the UN last year, fly in the face of everything that the Oslo process has been over the past 2 decades of sitting down and talking about these issues. And those kinds of unilateral steps can only lead to greater frustrations on both sides, raise tensions, and potentially lead to violence. And I think that would be a very, very unwise step on the part of the Palestinian leadership.
Doctor?
Yes, I think unilateral steps are bad news. This does not need to be underlined more clearly. There are several steps that Israel has already taken that are clearly unilateral steps, and they haven't helped, and they will not help, like the whole settlement issue, for instance, the very big issue of settlements. So it's very, arbitrary, and they've done it. It has hurt the peace process, just as the attempt of Abu Mazen to go to the UN unilaterally, which was met with failure, by the way, the first one for the Security Council. So that doesn't help. At some point in time, people must agree that unilateral steps really do indeed hurt, and let's avoid them.
Well, we only have time for one more question. There's obviously 80 million more I could ask, but we've got refugees, we've got borders, security needs, territorial questions, any number of issues on the table. What is the #1 sticking point in your estimation, Nathan, that's standing in the way of a peace deal?
I mentioned Hamas, but I'll also say this. President Abbas is still calling for millions of Palestinians to eventually flood the state of Israel, which would mean the destruction of Israel. This is a non-starter. And you don't hear within the Palestinian discourse today people talking about that maybe we might have to give up what they describe as the right of return. And that is a non-starter, like I said. And I think the Palestinian leadership needs to start talking to their own people about this. If you look at polls today, roughly 90% of Palestinians say they would never, ever give up the right of return in any deal. And until those numbers start to change and the Palestinian leadership starts talking to their own people about these basic compromises that they're going to have to make at the table as well, I think it will be difficult for us to reach an agreement.
Dr. Asali, what's the major sticking point in your estimation?
The attitude of everybody. They have to bring a serious attitude to this negotiation. I know, in public discourse, you need to make certain points to look like you're a hero and all that. But now we're talking about negotiations. Negotiations are about compromise, which means I give up something in order to get something. The essence of the compromise has already been resolved in all these years of negotiations, what you give and what you don't give. But we have had a mindset propagated, I have to say, by the politicians on all sides to continue the public being victimized and feeling that the other guy is terrible and cannot deal. The thing is a political issue that has to be resolved by a combination of tools, not just one thing. Of course, all the issues that you mentioned are still to be resolved. But they can only be resolved if the United States acts as the indispensable partner, which it already has, with the other partners, resolve their internal conflicts, resolve their internal squabbles politically to bring about a decision-making ability to the table, and then get on with it.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here on The Heat. Certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.